During World War II, the United States produced only 3 4-engined long-range bombers in any numbers. These were the B-29 Superfortress, the B-17 Flying Fortress, and the B-24 Liberator. The B-29 entered active service only in 1944, but played a large part in the reduction of Japan's wartime capacity, razing its cities and destroying its factories before delivering the final blows of the war in the atom bomb attacks. The B-17, the legendary Flying Fortress, was one of the war's most famous aircraft and a mainstay of the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. The Liberator was the other important American bomber of that campaign, but the B-24 has been overshadowed somewhat by its 2 illustrious contemporaries. In fact, it was produced in far larger numbers than either of them. A later design than the Fortress, its production began after the war had begun and halted before its end. Yet, in that time, over 18,000 of them were made. They saw service in every theatre of the conflict, in a variety of roles, and proved, despite their ugly duckling reputation, to be one of the most effective weapons of the war. In 1918, the United States' first airmail service was inaugurated, with President Wilson on hand to mail the first letter. The pilot of this first flight was Major Reuben Fleet. He was to go on to become one of America's great aviation entrepreneurs, forming the Con-solidated Company in Buffalo. In 1936, Fleet moved his company to California, establishing a new factory at San Diego. The move was made to have access to both sea and land drones for their planes, as they moved towards production of the series of flying boats that was to cement their reputation. When Con-solidated moved to California, they had just won a contract to produce the legendary PBY Catalina for the Navy and the Coast Guard, though at that time the potential of these excellent all-metal monoplanes as weapons was not fully realized. The Catalina was to be one of the most versatile models of the war, and even when the design became dated in the face of wartime technological advances, their reliability and versatility saw them continue in active service. Later variants of the plane featured a retractable undercarriage that made them amphibious and reinforced their versatility. Continuing on the success of the Catalinas, Con-solidated developed a new mammoth flying boat in conjunction with the Navy, the PB-2Y. This 4-engined Leviathan gave the company its first experience with large planes. Over 200 PB-2Ys were made, including some that were sold to Britain, although the design did not prove to be a major success. However, the twin tailplanes of the PB-2Y were to go on to be almost a signature of Con-solidated's future planes, and the technical knowledge gained in its construction was to serve the company well. PB-2Y's relative failure to meet the Navy's requirements left the problem of a successor for the twin-engined Catalinas unanswered. Consolidated were, of course, eager to be the company that came up with a satisfactory design for the replacement. Among the Consolidated staff who moved from Buffalo to stay with the company was Mac Ladden, the company's chief engineer. In 1938, Consolidated was offered rights to a completely new wing design, the Davis aerofoil, and the company bought the exclusive ownership of the technology. Initially, the wing was fitted to the Consolidated Model 31, the PB-4Y. Many thought that the theory of the wing was wrong and that it did not have a large enough surface area to lift and carry a large plane. These doubts were quashed by the wing's performance on the Model 31. The PB-4Y did not go into production. However, the high shoulder-mounted wing and deep fuselage of the flying boat were to reappear, heavily modified, on Consolidated's next project. The outbreak of war in Europe in September 1939 saw a change in US popular opinion and a growing awareness of the need for stronger defense of the nation. Back in 1938, with the threat of war clear to the strategists, the Army sought to increase production of its only four-engined long-range bomber, the Flying Fortress, and they approached Consolidated to be one of the companies dedicated to turning out numbers of B-17s. The reaction of Consolidated was that, rather than produce the Boeing design, they were confident that with their new wing technology, they could produce a better bomber. Given how pleased the Army was with the B-17s, the thought of a better bomber must have interested them greatly. The development of large planes had been very rapid up to the B-17, and clearly there could be further jumps in technology which embraced the lessons learned in its development. In January 1939, Consolidated were given the go-ahead to develop a design for a plane that could carry a 3,000-pound load 3,000 miles at a speed above 300 miles per hour. This was to be followed in March with a contract to build a prototype of the design. Mac Ladden's original design combined the now classic Consolidated tail, the aerofoil wing, tricycle undercarriage, and an advanced aerodynamic fuselage. The plane even had crew sleeping quarters because of the long flights expected. Eventually, a more conventional fuselage was adopted, with its high sides owing a lot to the PB-4Y flying boat's design. The plan view shows clearly the slim lines of the superbly efficient new wing. The Model 32, as it was known, was ready for its test flight on December the 29th, 1939, one day under the 9 months specified in the contract. An order for only 7 examples was made by the Army, but the French, satisfied with the data provided, placed an immediate order for 120 Model 32s off the drawing board. The British were not far behind in ordering 160 of the big new bombers, and with the fall of France, the French order was transferred to them, and the first of the planes to go into active service were British. Initially, the feature that stood out about the Liberator, as the English named it, was that it was the only plane capable of non-stop transatlantic flight, and the first 5 delivered were handed over to BOAC to be flown on that route, primarily to recycle the pilots who were ferrying planes from American factories to the European war zone. The first model to see truly mass production was the B-24D, with a longer nose and the addition of turbo superchargers to increase the plane's operational ceiling. The incorporation of the superchargers led to the repositioning of the oil coolers on the engines, which resulted in the characteristic elliptical nacelles that were to stay with the B-24 throughout the rest of its production life. On the 19th of August 1939, with the war still weeks away, German long-range submarines started taking up positions in the Atlantic. These U-boats were the first of many that were to fight in the Battle of the Atlantic. This cold, wet battleground, which saw the advantage sway back and forth throughout the war, became Germany's greatest chance of defeating Britain. Indeed, at times in 1942 and 43 in particular, the Allied losses in the Atlantic were to go very close to being unsustainable. During the 5.5 years of the war, the Germans commissioned 1,172 submarines, and 789 were lost. On the other side, Axis submarines, in all waters, sank 2,828 ships, totaling nearly 15 million tons. Much the greatest proportion of that huge total was sunk by the Germans, whose U-boats also sank 175 Allied warships. In the end, the battle was to be won with a combination of new weapons and tactics, and the U-boats were soundly defeated. Perhaps the single most important of the weapons employed in winning this battle was the Liberator. Before the B-24s came on the scene, there was a 300-mile gap in the middle of the ocean where the existing planes were unable to supply air cover for the slow, inadequately escorted convoys. In this gap, the U-boats, hunting in wolf packs, were able to regularly engage in massacres of the assembled targets, relatively unendangered and operating often on the surface, where they were faster than many of the corvettes and destroyers supposedly hunting them. The arrival of the Liberators closed the gap, and even the few that were initially available in 1941 caused the Germans to change their plans and saw Allied losses at sea drop. However, when these planes were misguidedly withdrawn in early 1942 for the strategic campaign against Germany, the U-boat's ascendancy was quickly re-established, and the Allies' losses soared alarmingly. It was not until more Liberators, with radar, lee lights and their long range, were sent back into the fray that the tide finally turned. Throughout the war, the Liberators saw service in another cold and wet battlefield, the Aleutian Islands, on the other side of the US in the northern Pacific. The American activity there was prompted by a Japanese feint at Dutch Harbour to cover and divert attention from their activity at Midway. Obviously, the threat of a landing on the American continent through Alaska was enough to warrant nullifying the Japanese presence, and America constructed a large airfield and installed a large garrison in this bleak, inhospitable, and otherwise uninhabited environment. For the American servicemen there, it was as if they had been sent to Siberia. As soon as the base was ready, the first B-24s were flown in. In addition to their obvious role as bombers, the B-24s were soon to be equipped for long-range prowling over the ocean, looking for submarines. In this area, with the opposing camps' islands so close together, the Japanese relied on subs for transport and used them to replenish their supplies and bring in reinforcements. In addition, submarines were used as assault transports in several attempts to move forward into the American-held islands. From the freezing cold of their aeroplanes, the aircrew returned to a base that was barely more comfortable, to report on their missions and to be briefed on their next targets. With the requirements for long-range bombing limited, the B-24's enormous load carrying could be tested, and they regularly delivered bomb loads equivalent to twice what they carried in the European theatre. The sparring in the Aleutians went on throughout the war, with neither side pressing hard on the other's strong defences. However, the B-24s regularly took off from American-held ADAC to make their own contribution to the miseries of the weather on the Japanese base at Kiska. Far to the south, where the palm trees sway on picture postcard islands, the war went on with its own different ferocity. Here, the long range of the Liberators was of paramount importance and saw them virtually replace all of the fortresses. Instead of huddling in shelter, here, while the ground staff readied their planes for a mission, the aircrew could relax outdoors. Because of the way they were trained and served together, each crew became a coherent unit, their inter-reliance reinforced with a team pride. The individual nose-out of their planes was in some ways identification of their clubs. Other individualizing was less ambiguous. Under the wing of their plane, a crew goes through a briefing on this day's target, and the men ready themselves for the flight. Even in the tropical heat, the leather flying suits are pulled on. It is very cold in an unpressurized, drafty bomber at 20,000 feet. The ground crew finished their routines. The propellers are rotated to clear oil from the cylinders. The forward crew make their way into the cramped and difficult entry through the front wheel bay. The rest clamber up through the bomb bay, crouching uncomfortably under the corrugated sliding doors. The pilots finish their pre-flight checks with a spin of the superchargers. time to go. In the Pacific, the predators of the B-24 were the Japanese fighters, most famously the Zero, lightly armed and relatively slow, but phenomenally maneuverable. In the hands of a skilled pilot, the Zero was capable of outfighting the faster, more powerful American fighters. Captured Zeros were returned to the States to be evaluated and studied, as was the other outstanding Axis fighter, the Focke-Wulf 190. Faster, more advanced and heavily armed, the 190 was a match for any of the Allies' planes as the strategic bombing campaign dragged on in the furious war in Europe. The B-24s were, by now, in the thick of the fray in large numbers, and many flew from Britain with the 8th Air Force. Here, before a raid over Germany, the crews prepare. Their flying suits are electrically heated, and still they will feel the cold. They collect their flight kits and leave their personal possessions. Who knows what went through their minds as they set out on these missions? The losses were alarmingly high, and the chances of finishing a full tour of duty were, at times in the war, negligible. One of the consequences of the combat losses was a constant enlargement and improvement of the armament of the planes. Here, in an experiment, the whole nose of a B-17, complete with chin turret, has been welded onto a B-24. This was a one-off experiment, but the chin turrets and many other combinations of guns were fitted to the various models of the Liberator. At one time, B-24s carried turrets manufactured by 4 different companies, covering its hide in a hopeful wall of firepower. But, as the crews were only too painfully aware, large lumbering bombers are powerless to protect themselves fully against planes that have been expressly designed to blast them out of the air. The bombing offensive against occupied Europe was nearly abandoned, And indeed, the battle would have been lost without the development of longer range for fighter escorts. With reliance on drop tanks for additional fuel, the P-47s, P-38s and P-51s were able to take the Luftwaffe on in extended battles that first saw the German Air Force whittled down and eventually destroyed. Unable to simply accompany the bombers on their long voyages, the escorts would fly in 3 waves. The first wave would fly out with the attackers, and the next wave would take over for the second leg, the approach to the target. Then the third group of fighters would fly off to meet them and shepherd their return. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe would scramble to meet the incoming attackers. An extended campaign was directed at the Luftwaffe. In addition to the fighters knocking them out of the skies, the bombers themselves joined in, bombing the aircraft factories, aerodromes and oil supplies. The ultimate success of this effort paved the way for the liberation of Europe and the extensive success of the strategic bombing through late '44 and into 1945. But as long as they had any planes, fuel and ammunition, the German pilots kept attacking, right to the end of the war. The bombing reached and maintained a crescendo from before D-Day through the drive towards Berlin. and daily the bombers would hammer their targets across Europe. Each day, most of the Liberators would return to their bases, often damaged, sometimes barely flying, often carrying wounded or dead members of their crew. Part of the versatility of the Liberator stemmed from the capacity of its high-sided fuselage, and even the bombers were often pressed into duty as transport planes. This mission will see them flying low over the battlefields on the Rhine, dropping supplies to the army below. At the end of the war, this cargo capability was to see them ferry huge amounts of supplies to the refugee-swollen cities of Europe, isolated by the devastation of the transport systems and short of all the basics of life, including food and medicines. The capacity of the plane had been recognized early, and true transport variants of the B-24 were produced from very early in the model's existence, seeing much service, perhaps most notably flying supplies into China, but they were there in all the theatres of the conflict. One of the Liberator's long-running battles was that over Polesti in Romania, one of the Germans' few large oil fields and site of refineries that provided about 35% of their oil needs. The first raid against Polesti was flown in 1942 with 13 early model B-24s flying from Khartoum in Egypt. They didn't do much damage to the refineries, but they did alert the Germans to this unexpected source of threat to their precious supplies. As a result, the defences of the area were strengthened and the scene was set for the long and bloody series of attacks that were to follow. It wasn't until the 1st of August 1943 that the next raid occurred. This time, the attack was to be mounted by 178 specially assembled Liberators, flying from bases in North Africa, and was to be delivered at extremely low level to fly under the enemy radar. In the long flight to the target, the groups became separated, and the arrival of the first planes meant that the Germans were thoroughly alerted by the time the rest of the bombers arrived. Firing at minimum elevation, directly at the oncoming planes, the flak tore holes in the attacking formations, and with Romanian and German fighters attacking on the way back, of the 166 planes that reached the target, 54 were lost. However, major damage was done to the refineries, and they were still regaining their lost production 8 months later when a series of high-altitude raids commenced, with planes of the 15th Air Force flying from bases in Italy and escorted by long-range fighters. The high-level attacks continued through till the Russians overran the still marginally functioning but devastated oil centre. By then, the 15th had flown 5,479 sorties against Polesti, one of Europe's most heavily and ably defended locations, and had lost 223 planes. The donut parade after a mission to Polesti could be a very sombre affair. In the Pacific, the island-hopping campaign meant that a series of airfields were developed that moved the effective range of the Liberators further and further into the Japanese Empire. Both the Army and the Navy used the Liberators in many more roles than had been originally contemplated. In addition to bombing raids, transport duties and anti-submarine patrols, they saw service as reconnaissance planes, tankers, search and rescue aircraft and personnel carriers. As the war had gone on, the B-24s had continued evolving through a succession of models, with the loads carried soaring at times to improbable levels. Often the Liberators were loaded to the point of being difficult to handle, but still the big planes coped. The design was developed to the B-32 Dominator, which was originally devised as a backup for the B-29 in case the Boeing plane might fail to meet the Army's specifications. However, the Superfortress was a success, and only 150 B-32s were built, seeing limited active service with the 5th Air Force in the Pacific. With war's end, the Army came home. By then, the Liberators had contributed huge service in the conflict. By the time this plane's war was over, virtually every moving part had been replaced at least once. Like many other B-24s, her side is covered with the symbols of her work. And also, like many others, she bears the personalizing and messages of her grateful and affectionate crew. Unglamorous and perhaps unaesthetic, the B-24s earned their place in history the hard way, with results.